Yeah, grouse in the mist. Who remembers? Who's from the area and remembers grouse in the 70s and 80s? Just the one couple people? It was like popcorn. We've got a farm down near Viola, and when I was getting into my teenage hunting years, grouse, I'm not exaggerating, were everywhere. You would walk up our valley, you'd flush 20 grouse in a short walk. Contrast that to today. Who's seen a grouse in the last year? They're almost gone. There's still a pocket of rough grouse here and there. So when I was hired at E.W. Richland in the late 1990s as a wildlife guy, you're required to do some professional development research. I wanted to understand this decline and understand why grouse have disappeared into the mist. Who remembers that movie? Diane Fossey, that I stole this name from, Gorillas in the Mist. But at any rate, that's where we're headed tonight. Starting with a very broad general question, are our forests in the Driftless region healthy? They certainly look like it, right? Tourists come in this time of year to see the fall colors. You drive up and down these winding roads and the hillsides are forested. They look great. It depends on what you mean by healthy. And as we'll see, our forests, like forests everywhere, have changed and are changing in a big way to the benefit of some species and the detriment of others. And one of the species for which that change has been detrimental, we'll explore this in detail, has been ruffed grouse. Okay? One of the key aspects of forest dynamics, forest ecology, is this very, I think, well recognized and understood process of vegetational succession. You all know what I'm talking about, right? You stop planting corn in a field, 3 years later it's covered with annual grasses and forbs, then the prickly ash and sumac move in, then pretty soon there's an oak tree growing. 50 years later it's a young forest community, 200 years later it's a mature forest with big sugar maples, etc. So that successional pathway, which all vegetational communities progress through over time, is really at the heart of understanding forest dynamics. Succession will always push vegetational communities, with a few exceptions, towards some climax community. What's the climax forest community around here? Sugar maple and basswood forests. Sugar maple, basswood forests are, with some exceptions depending on soil type, but that's where all of our forested acreage is heading. But when you think about the wildlife that are dependent on forest communities, not all wildlife do well in open, mature forest communities. Some do, but some species require these brushy, young forest habitats. Ruffed grouse is one of them. Okay? Notice that ruffed grouse utilize habitats through this portion of forest succession, but not this, right? Maintaining habitat for those species that require earlier successional forest types requires disturbance. Prior to settlement, has anybody seen Finley's map, the pre-settlement vegetation of Wisconsin? A lot of prairies and savannas in southern Wisconsin, but the forest communities were riddled and diverse with all different forest types, from sugar maple, basswood, oaks, etc., etc. Why? Disturbance. These forests will succeed toward the climax, but disturbance will set them back. Things like wildfire, wind throw, disease. So if you look at forests on the landscape scale, there's going to be all these different types present as succession and disturbance sort of work together to create a very, very diverse mosaic of forest types on the landscape. What have we done in terms of the disturbance regimes that historically governed our forests here in the Driftless? Largely eliminated them, right? We don't allow wildfires to rage from Prairie to Shane to Madison. We control disease. Small wind throw events are about what we have. We can implement disturbance in the form of timber harvest within the confines of sound forest management to create this habitat, but largely we have dampened historic disturbance regimes and allowed succession to push more and more of our forests toward that older type that again does not provide habitat for ruffed grouse. Looking at the data, there's a huge data set that you guys can feel free to peruse online called the Forest Inventory and Analysis Data. And I scoured this data for the surveys in 1980, and then 2015 was the most recent one I looked at. And I looked at the age distribution, how old the forests and the driftless were. In the mid-80s, we had 3.2 million acres of total forest, excuse me, in the driftless, and about 300,000 of that was less than 10 years old. It was that brushy young forest habitat type. So about 9% of all the forested land in the driftless was young forest, was grouse habitat. Already by 2015, given land use changes, we gained 500,000 acres of forest cover. These small old fields that were no longer tilled, converting to forest cover. But the amount of young forest habitat, the amount of grouse cover, had dropped precipitously to under 2% of that landscape. So the big picture is there's less grouse habitat out there. There's more details there. This is something, when I was doing this research, I would go out and talk to farmers and landowners on whose property I was trapping and radio collaring grouse. And I would talk about the lack of young forest. And invariably, they would say, what are you talking about? There's as much forest here as when I was a kid 70 years ago. Failing to understand that not all forest is equal in the eyes of a ruffed grouse. That young forest cover disappears in 20 years. And it's no longer, to the point it's no longer usable by grouse. Looking at that decline in a number of states, including Wisconsin, the percent of young forest cover that was lost during that brief 30-year period, nearly 90% of the young forest cover in southeastern Minnesota. Okay? In total, across the driftless, about 80% of the grouse cover disappeared. And frustrated the heck out of me as somebody who came on the scene falling in love with our farm, in part because of all these cool ruffed grouse that were out there. They're almost gone. Okay? So the habitat has changed. We've got a lot less of forests that look like this or this, and a lot more forests that look like this or this. To put it simply, why does that matter for a ruffed grouse? What are ruffed grouse? They are hunks of meatloaf with wings. They are there to be eaten. So when you think of our predator community, the bobcats, the coyotes, the red fox, the barred owls, etc., what chance does a ruffed grouse have here? Well, pretty good. What does it have in the understory here? 0. This is a death trap for grouse, right? And again, looking at that FIA data, that transition has changed a lot of this into this. And if you've been out in these driftless forests since the 70s, you probably have picked up on that. Walking out of the back door of my grandmother's farmhouse in the early 80s when I was starting to hunt grouse, you literally had to crawl up the hillside to get under that prickly ash and the sumac and the red cedar that had invaded my grandpa's old pastured hillside. Nowadays, you can just walk right up. The trees are this big, right? Very different from the eyes of a ruffed grouse. But it's a hard message to sell. If we're interested in wildlife, interested in the environment, it's very obvious that certain ecosystems, certain habitat types are in peril, and that makes us want to do something. For example, if we're into waterfowl, do we recognize the impact of wetland loss, wetland drainage, wetland conversion on those waterfowl? Yeah. And all of a sudden there are groups like the Wetlands Trust and Ducks Unlimited with hundreds of thousands of members pouring dollars into trying to save the habitat that remains for those birds. If you're interested in grassland birds, pheasants, meadowlarks, etc., do you recognize the impact that conversion of grassland to cropland has on those species? Absolutely. And there are groups like the Prairie Enthusiasts and Pheasants Forever, with thousands upon thousands of members trying to do something about that. But if you appreciate wildlife species adapted to young forests, you recognize the impact of forest maturation. Little trees becoming big trees. Generally, no. The public's like, well, what do you mean? It's still trees. Why can't these birds live there? Again, very different habitats. So part of the challenge of managing young forest habitat is increasing recognition of this as a problem, okay? So what happened? So yeah, we've lost a whole bunch of young forest habitat in the driftless. Our forests are getting older. You have to understand the history. This, by the way, Beth mentioned, I'm living on our 8th-generation family farm. I'm generation 6, but we just had our first grandson, so he's generation 8. This is my great-great-grandfather, and this is the head of our valley. He experienced our farm in a way I never will, very different than mine. But he, along with all the other settlers across the driftless, did what? They cleared the forests and cropped the flat ridge tops and the flat valleys. They fenced off the hillsides, and that was pasture for their livestock, right? You can't walk into a woods from the valley still without at some point having a barbed wire fence run across your knees. Those hillsides were pasture. And like the woodpile suggests here, they were extracting firewood, building materials, so the hillsides adopted this sort of open park-like structure. Pastured for a century, grasses growing between these large oak trees, etc. But in the 50s, 60s, 70s, woodland pasturage was understood to be not in the best interest of the cows. They're not getting a lot of protein, not getting a lot of energy, and all of a sudden, instead of the cows being fenced into the woods, they were being fenced out of the woods. Confinement operations, etc. So what happens? Succession. Those open hillsides got brushy in the 50s, 60s, 70s, into the 80s, and young forest species boomed. That's where I just happened to come along at the boom after my grandpa 20 years before had stopped pasturing our hillsides. And it's that same story across the driftless. Give you an example. This is one of the study areas on which we studied grouse. This is Highway 56, just the other side of Iola. There's River Road, if you're familiar with that chunk of land. In 1937, the first aerial photographs taken in the driftless here. And you see the forested hillsides, but you see they're very broken up, right? Individual trees can be picked out. Very open, pastured, the valleys have been cleared, they're being cropped. Ridgetop fields have been cleared, they're being cropped. But look what happens when we jump just a few decades ahead to the early 2000s. Same landscape. Now, this is pole-sized timber or better, pole, small saw log-sized timber. Every chunk of ground that's not right in the valley bottom is covered in trees. Between this and this was one hell of a lot of ruffed grouse covered. And therefore we had one hell of a lot of ruffed grouse using it. Okay? You probably wouldn't find a single grouse here anymore because the forests have gotten too old. Okay? And I understand, lest you're sitting there, as folks in every talk I've given on this subject do, lest you're sitting there thinking, no, it's coyotes. I know it's the predators, bobcats, owls. That's what's killing our grouse. Every grouse that hatches ends up in a stomach. I'm not discounting the effects of predators, but think of it like this. Say you have a room in your house with no furniture in it, just a wood floor and walls. A mouse gets in there, and then you let your cat into the room. What chance does that mouse have? It's dead, right? Now say your kids come home from college and they dump all their stuff in that room. There's piles of magazines, there's boxes tipped over, there's a bed sitting in the corner. And what chance does that mouse have now? It's got some cover. It may meet another mouse, and they may have baby mice, and the cat's frustrated because it smells mice but it can't get to them. Same thing happens when we go from young forest, where there's protective cover for grouse, to an older forest where there's none. Okay? So I'm not discounting the effect of predators, but the effect of predation is mediated by deteriorating habitat quality. This is what the data tell us. The DNR for, 70 years now or thereabouts, has annually conducted surveys of ruffed grouse across the state. Biologists go out, and I used to run a number of these routes. You stop every mile, you get out, you listen for grouse, you write down how many drums you heard. In northern Wisconsin, where we've still got healthy grouse populations, the grouse population has cycled through time. And it's a famous place amongst grouse hunters to gravitate toward every fall, because you can find grouse. During a grouse peak, there's grouse everywhere. You can limit out, you can have a great day in the field with a dog. Back in the 70s and early 80s, we had more grouse in the Driftless region in most years than they do in northern Wisconsin during peak years. They were, like I said, they were everywhere around here. Look at that peak. Massive grouse populations in the Driftless. But then, boom, here we sit even further down out here in 2024. Why? The woods got older. That's the answer. Okay. You might ask, why do we still have lots of ruffed grouse in northern Wisconsin? We'll get to that in a minute. And it's not just us down here in the Driftless. Here's northern Wisconsin. Cyclic but fairly stable over time grouse populations. As we've seen, ours are plummeting. You look at data from Kentucky, Ohio, Pennsylvania. All along the southern fringe of ruffed grouse range, they've seen their populations collapse. Okay? So, to understand this, like I said, I'll talk about the research my students and I conducted. We wanted to investigate this. We picked out 4 study areas in Richland County, primarily on private lands. I wanted to point that out. I talked to 63, I think, landowners, because to study a wildlife species that moves around a bit, in this country, you got to have access to private lands. They were hesitant to let me on their lands, to let my students on their lands, until I told them we wanted to understand what happened to grouse. Only one person said, no, I don't want you. 62 out of the 63 said, oh, I'd love to know what. I used to love seeing those grouse, hearing those grouse. So a nod to the private landowners. We ended up catching not as many as I wanted. I wanted 100 grouse in our sample, but given the low grouse numbers, 56 grouse over those 4 years was pretty good. We aged and sexed the birds, looking at various feather characteristics, so we knew if we had a juvenile male and an adult female, what have you. Man, isn't that beautiful? Who feels damn lucky to live in the Driftless? I just wish there were more grouse. We put a little necklace-style transmitter. This is not a GPS transmitter, which are common nowadays. We had to go out, locate them with an antenna. It had a mortality switch. If the transmitter remained motionless for 8 hours, the signal would change. Why would a transmitter not move for 8 hours? Because the grouse is in grouse heaven, right? So we would then walk in, use sign at the kill site to try and infer what might have happened to that bird. Then we released them with their transmitter and simply spent the rest of that grouse's life chasing them around 3 to 4 times a week so we could locate them, determine what habitat they were in, whether or not they were still alive, etc., etc. Okay? So, there's a whole bunch of cool information, things we learned, but one of the cooler things, what does that older forest mean for ruffed grouse and other young forest or YF species? In the case of grouse around here, one of the interesting things we learned, females were getting slaughtered. Males were actually surviving fairly well throughout the year. When I did some survival analyses looking at survival rates of males versus females, male survival rates throughout the year about 43%, which is actually good because remember, grouse are pieces of meatloaf with wings. Survival rates of 35 to 55% are about what you see wherever grouse have been studied across their range. Okay, that's why they lay 12 eggs and will re-nest if they lose their eggs, because survival rates are typically fairly low. But females, only about 15 out of 100 would survive from one year to the next. And most of that mortality was occurring in the late winter and early spring. It was frustrating because I wanted also to document clutch size and monitor some grouse chicks through to fledging. But every year we'd work and work and work, and we'd get 15 females with transmitters. I'm like, oh, we're going to have all kinds of nests. By the time nesting came, they were all dead. And we had all these dumb males flying around we were following. Okay? So why was that? Why were females surviving at a much lower rate, an unsustainably low rate in terms of population dynamics than males? Well, one of my technicians, one of my students came in, and he said, I am having a heck of a time finding the females. The males are always in the same spot. I find them real easy every day. So we started to look at that using our GIS software. These are the movements of a male grouse, good old M9714, from November 1st through April 1st. And you see that that bird found a patch of remaining thick young forest cover, and he did move. There were some aspen trees there, he had food, he had this dense young layer of entirely exotic species, but we won't talk about that. But he had some thick cover, never moved. Spring came, he just hopped up on a log and started to drum, and he was safe. A female grouse that spent the winter months in that same patch of habitat, as soon as we started to get into March, started to pop up all over the landscape, moving miles. And this difference was repeated when we looked at males versus females across our study. And I started to wonder why. Well, I calculated something called a wandering index, which basically is an index to how much the birds are moving away from some point of origin. If you want to know how I calculated that, it's boring, but it reflects movements across the landscape rather than around a confined area within the landscape. Looking at adult females in red and adult males in white, the same months that the females were dying, they were going through again these long distance wandering movements. That young forest habitat that keeps them safe from predators had largely matured so that it only remained in small little patches, the edge of a field here, a little opening here, where a few trees tipped over there. And when they were moving across that interstitial area, or the mature forest, they were getting picked off. Okay? And we'll talk more about sort of the landscape impacts of this forest maturation in a bit, but kind of interesting. You can't maintain a ruffed grouse population if you can't maintain females, right? I'm not a brilliant biologist, but I do know that. So, there's a lot less young forest habitat than there was back in my teenage years, 30 plus years ago. What remains, there's still brush out there, right? You guys probably go out picking berries, you get little, there's still thick cover out there, but it's not vast 50-acre swaths going up over the ridge. It's little stretches along field edges. I should explain too, so part of our study was doing habitat typing. So we would take our study areas and we would break the whole thing down into like 28 different habitats, one of which was young forest, very dense young forest. And we found that, yeah, it's out there, but it's little tiny pockets along field edges, occasionally a relatively large block of a couple acres, maybe a few acres in size. But across this entire forested landscape now, this is the grouse habitat that remained. You might say, well, there's some, so there should be some grouse. It's not that simple. There's landscape scale things, source sink dynamics, which we'll talk about in a minute as well. So when we added all that up and looked at the existing young forest habitat by patch size in my GIS, there was almost no young forest habitat larger than 2 acres in size. The vast majority of it is smaller than an acre. So again, those small little linear field edge patches, etc. If you know anything about aspen, aspen is a very disturbance dependent tree species, right? That's why we have so many grouse left in northern Wisconsin, because they're always clear cutting aspen for the pulp industry to produce paper. Across all of our study areas, and I think we habitat type like 6,000 acres in total, something like that, there was aspen there, which gives us the potential to regenerate young forest cover. We'll talk about that in a bit. We found no sapling aspen. No aspen less than 4 acres in diameter. Aspen's only going to appear where there's been disturbance. It's a very, you guys know anything about aspen, very disturbance dependent tree species. Its existence tells us that this forest in the past had been disturbed to a significant extent. Why? A century of grazing. These are all formerly pastured wooded hillsides. Cows came out of the woods, boom, aspen comes in. But it came in and it grew up with the rest of the forest, and it's all older. Again, 6,000 acres, not a single little pocket of small aspen. And that idea of succession, forests changing through time, who thinks we've got a whole pile of oak in the Driftless? Put your hand in the air, because you'd be right. But we're losing it. We're losing it rapidly. I'll focus on that in just a second as well. One of our habitat types was OM, oak converting to maple. Forests that you've probably seen that look like this. Here's a big red oak tree, right? What's this in the understory? It's all sugar maple seedlings. Sugar maple can tolerate shade, growing in shade, more than any other tree species we've got here in the Driftless. This oak will never regenerate itself. It will continue to drop acorns, but young oak trees need sunlight. Those maples are insidious little bastards. They're not going to let another oak tree grow on that site. So what you have over time, again, that successional pathway, you've got oak and other disturbance-dependent communities converting to aspen. That was the most dominant habitat type on all of our study sites. Okay? And again, once you remember that initial figure with the succession, open areas, shrubs to trees, a lot of our forests are going to end up in that maple basswood climax class that provides zero habitat for ruffed grouse. Okay? Looking a lot like that. All right, if you're a landowner wanting to do something for ruffed grouse, you can do whatever you want on your land, right? Like this is the farm I love. I'm gonna hug it. This is the Walter farm down near Viola. There's my son shooting baskets in the driveway. He's supposed to be mowing lawn. And I do a lot of habitat. I've still got a few ruffed grouse. Every year we've got 1 or 2 drumming males, because I very actively, over my adult life, have done things to maintain some grouse cover. But in a population sense, Am I ever going to be able to save grouse in the driftless? No, because this is the landscape in which our farm lies. This is Elk Creek, County U, right? Doing something meaningful means having access to large chunks of public land and an agency that adopts active forage management to maintain diversity as its principle. It means getting out and talking to landowners, engaging your neighbors, suggesting that chainsaws aren't inherently evil, right? Question?
Yeah, kind of convinced me a little bit about the habitat of the grouse, although I don't agree with most of it. But does that, your explanation about the disappearance of the rough grouse, is that also the same reason that the whippoorwills and the local woodcocks and the veeries and the wood thrushes and all those other birds disappeared because of the same habitat change as the grouse got to?
Probably not. Each species has its own habitat needs, and therefore if you see a population decline, the drivers are probably slightly different. There's been a lot of interest in whippoorwills. The best explanation I've heard, though I haven't seen a lot of good data to support this, is historically they were a savanna-dependent species. They liked open forests with scattered big trees and did very well, therefore, in pastured woodlands. Right?
One of the things that ties all those species together is that they're all ground masters.
Yep.
And if you drive anywhere within 5 mile, and 5 mile trip out there, there's dead coon and there's dead possum and there's dead skunks everywhere. And if you extrapolate that, there's probably 100 coon per square mile out there every single night looking for something to eat. And with fur prices dropping back in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s, there's no harvest on a lot of those animals. So it seems to me, I mean, it seems like the possibility of predation by small mammals is way more accountable for the loss of the grouse and habitat change. The grouse, in my opinion, are very adaptable. They live in northern Wisconsin, they live in Canada, they live in the Driftless Region, they live in the southern counties clear in the south of Madison, and they adapted to those different kinds of habitats. And so, if you're going to count them out because they're too rigid in their habitat requirements, then how they adapted to other environments. In the Driftless Region alone, they got many different kinds of ecosystems. You got ecosystems that are on the east side of the Driftless Region, ecosystems that are along the Mississippi, ecosystems in the southern end of it, the northern end of it, the northern forest. If grouse were not adaptable, would they even be in all of those different habitats and all those different ecosystems?
So the answer to your last question is no. Grouse are a young forest adapted species. The reason that healthy populations exist elsewhere is their forest management is different. And we'll get into this a bit more, but in northern Wisconsin, where grouse numbers are still healthy, there's a pulpwood industry. They are clear-cutting aspen all over the place. You've been up there, you've seen the truckloads of aspen logs heading to the mill. That aspen then comes up in a very dense fashion, providing habitat for grouse. But thank you for bringing up the predation question. Didn't I say every talk I've ever given, this is what folks gravitate toward, predators as an explanation? There have always been predators on the landscape. And I would argue there have always been abundant predator populations on the landscape. Give you an example. I was given a talk similar to this to the Grant County Sportsmen's Alliance down in Platteville or somewhere years ago. And I was going through my habitat explanation for the grouse decline, and a gentleman stood up and said, I think that's all hogwash. The problem is predators. There's too many raccoons. There's too many. He said, we used to trap them out. Every kid, farm kid years ago, had a 22, had a set of leg hold traps and those things. And then he said, my uncle, for example, when I was a kid, he would cover the side of his barn with raccoon hides every year. So we didn't have any raccoons. And I stopped him. I said, well, wait a minute now. Your uncle covered the side of his barn with raccoon hides every year, so he didn't have raccoons. Damn right! And I said, well, then how did he cover the side of his barn with raccoon hides every year? Well, and you get tongue-tied. He couldn't. So I think predators have always been here, but the grouse were able to survive predation when they had access to sufficient cover.
Cornell University did a study and collected information on grassland birds, and they found that white-tailed deer were eating bird chicks out of nests. So with the increase in white-tailed populations all over the place, it's no surprise to me that white-tailed deer can impact
deer
ground nesting birds just as much as
Yeah, deer have had a big impact on habitats beyond nipped in the eye. And by the way, you know, the first person, and Beth, you were probably on campus when this happened, but the first person to document with a camera a deer eating a nestling, I think it was a Dixisel or something, was Roz Renfrew at UW-Madison. And then folks have gone on at Cornell and elsewhere to study it. But so my contention is that with sufficient habitat, grouse will do fine, even in the face of these predators. For example, I was telling somebody before we started tonight about this. I was just talking with a guy over by Hillsboro who hadn't seen grouse. He is old enough, he remembers the heyday of grouse in the 80s, then they declined. And he said the last 4 or 5 years, he said, I'm hunting grouse on our farm. They had a tornado or a serious wind event a decade before that knocked down the forest. He said it's a tangle of prickly ash, and he said the grouse are everywhere. Provide the habitat, the birds will do okay. But back to this thought. We got to work across fences. We've got to consider that grouse and all other wildlife species need landscapes to support healthy populations. When we looked at this landscape view of ruffed grouse on our study areas, this is a shot of our Gotham study areas. Who says Gotham? You know the little town? Anybody say Gotham? Because the Batman got all that? Yeah, it's cool. Well, you see, this is the young forest cover. You see, in this area, we had some fairly large pockets of grouse cover. Even though most of them were relatively small, there were some big chunks out there. And when we started to think about what we were seeing from our telemetry data, this area, it was like walking back into the 1980s. We would always find grouse. We trapped 70% of our grouse on this study area in this circle, in that area. And you see big chunks of habitat, right? So there were grouse. But we also would find grouse on this landscape out here in these little patches that themselves certainly couldn't sustain grouse. And what we thought was probably happening was this area was acting as a source, very good cover, lots of chicks being hatched every year, surviving well, and they're dispersing out and colonizing all these small pockets of habitat on the landscape. Why is that important? When you start thinking about wildlife ecology, wildlife populations, what makes a healthy population, what makes a declining population, it's not, we all too often with a little microscope focus on this habitat. This looks like great grouse habitat, but there's no grouse there, so it must be something else. These animals utilize landscapes, right? And in this context, it was clear to us that this area with relatively large blocks of habitat was maintaining grouse populations across the landscape. In other words, what would happen to the grouse population here if the landowner went out and converted this to corn, this little patch of brush? Nothing. But what would happen if this landowner decided he would rather plant apple trees here or didn't like this brushy patch? You would lose grouse across the entire landscape. The existence of grouse on the landscape is probably due to the high reproductive rates in that source patch. Why do I go into that briefly? Because I hear from folks all the time that, look at that cover, Scott. that is great grouse cover. I say, yeah. And he'll say, but there's no grouse there, so it's the dang barn owls, or the guys hear coyotes every night. We've got great cover, yet there's no grouse using it. So therefore it's got to be something else. Well, what happens is the case if that patch of beautiful looking young, I shouldn't say beautiful because it's multiflora and but dense young forest cover, if you view it in the landscape, at the landscape scale, this is that patch, right? With no source population around it. We've got a landscape devoid of grouse because there's no large patches to provide grouse for the small patches on the landscape. Make sense? So yeah, it's easy to look at that and say there's no grouse, must be predators, must be disease, must be something else. You always have to think at the landscape scale. I almost don't want to talk about this because I made this graph and it's disgusting and confusing and tip on your head. What it shows you that across, since we had our habitat data in a GIS, we were able to look at grouse use, their home range maps, by patch size, the size of the brushy young forest patches. And what this shows you, that grouse essentially didn't use any of these patches of grouse habitat until they were about 2 acres in size. Then grouse shut up. Unless that patch was very near a large patch. Then they would start to use it, okay? So you got a landscape with lots of grouse habitat. If it's all little field fringes along field edges and a small pocket, that's not a grouse landscape, even though it's got some grouse habitat, if that makes sense. Wanted to mention the situation with oak forests. You can have healthy grouse populations in an oak system if the oak is being regenerated through shelterwood harvest, silvicultural techniques routinely. Oak, we're going to burn about 30 acres of oak the day after Thanksgiving, hopefully, if the weather permits, on our farm, because I want to leave my kids and their kids and their kids some oak trees. Remember, our forests are going to sugar maple. We're syrup producers now, but I want to save oak for wildlife benefits, for biodiversity goals, etc. This is that forest inventory and analysis data for oak forests across Wisconsin. If the human age distribution looked like this, what would you say? This is the age class down here. You'd say, we're going extinct. There aren't enough babies being born to replace the old folks out there. That's exactly what oak forests in Wisconsin and across the Midwest and Eastern states look like, right? Almost all of our oak forests are from 40 to 120 years old. There's very little young oak forest out there. Why? Remember that picture of the big oak tree with all the, it's all succeeding. This is now all sugar maple or some other later successional species. Oak is fire adapted. Oak requires disturbance. If we don't disturb our forests intentionally to regenerate things like oak, they're going to disappear. Imagine a forest with no acorns in the fall. That's where we're headed. So a lack of disturbance. And this, I mentioned a couple times, we've still got healthy grouse populations in northern Wisconsin, not in the driftless any longer. Why? What's the difference? This is what our timber sales tend to look like around here. Selective harvesting. Either because it's a northern hardwood stand and that's the appropriate silvicultural technique, or the forester talks to the landowner and says, you've got the opportunity to regenerate oak, you need to clear cut or shelterwood harvest this stand. Clear cut, boom, red flag goes up, no way, keep your chainsaws out of my woods. Okay, northern Wisconsin, they're clear cutting tens of thousands of acres a year to regenerate aspen and provide pulp to the paper mills. That's all going to be grouse habitat. So there's the difference right there. Problem is, generally the public thinks this is an abuse of nature. That intensive timber, and it can be, right? If it's just done willy-nilly without a silvicultural prescription, it can be bad. But what we're doing with properly applied intensive timber harvest is mimicking nature, the fire and the wind throw that used to allow aspen and oak to perpetuate on the landscape. And unfortunately, the issue, like many issues, begets emotion. And people get involved and rally against those evil DNR folks that clear-cut the stand of oak on along their favorite walking trail. This is an interesting, you can go online probably still and watch this video, but the Indiana DNR, understanding they were losing all their young forest and they were losing their oak forest, did something tragic. They went out and they harvested a whole bunch of big oak trees on a state wildlife area. Their goal was to regenerate oak. They knew if they didn't do anything, it was going to succeed to later successional forest types. They thought they had an opportunity to do something good. They did, and an alliance formed, the Indiana Forest Alliance. They put videos, they were writing legislators, running roughshod over those state foresters that had destroyed their public property. And in this video, I don't know if it's this woman or one of the alliance members, they said, even my neighbor had all his sheep killed by coyotes because they cut the trees down. And you're like, what? How did, what? So emotion gets in. And I don't know if you folks are aware, but misinformation is fairly pervasive these days. And there's agendas and emotions driving a lot of this backlash that foresters sometimes face. But at any rate, you understand that clear cuts, just that term, is used in a negative sense. But the public doesn't understand that all these avian species, indigo bunting, juncos, savannas, blah, 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 like ruffed grouse, they've got habitat needs that require a very narrow slice of that forest successional continuum, right? Like indigo buntings are common only in the first decade or so of a forest life. After that, tree's too big, it's not suitable habitat. Common yellow throats, young brushy forests associated with grasslands. You could come up with 100 graphs like this. The only way to maintain habitat for these birds is through disturbance. If you look at all the state SWAPs, our state wildlife action plans, 57 species of greatest conservation need collectively are listed in these plans as being shrubland or young forest obligates, okay, including mammals, reptiles, etc., etc. So what we're seeing in the driftless transition of young forest to climax forest, while driving up the road, the hill looks the same. It's having an impact on our wildlife community. Structural diversity as well as species diversity is important. Forest management, in our case locally, usually putting chainsaw to tree is critical if you want to maintain diversity. Okay? Hands-off approach, as we've seen over the last half century, leads to more uniform, older forest types, and young forest species lose out. So really quickly, what can we do? Timber stand improvement, okay? Trying to improve the species composition, health, and vigor of your timber-producing stems on your land. This is a chunk of our farm where I did a TSI. That's grouse cover. I mentioned we still have the odd Drummond male, 2 or 3 every year. It's because we've done work like that. Regenerate some of those aspen clones. All these older aspen clones, just like in northern Wisconsin, if you go in and cut them down from the roots, they're going to shoot up a dense young thicket that grouse and deer and other wildlife will utilize. Tell you a really quick story if you haven't figured out by now. None of my stories are quick, but this one will be quick. When we were doing our grouse work, I ran into one of those old aspen clones in our study area down by Gotham. I happened to work with the woman that owned it, and I said, Linda, you really should clear cut that, or the aspen's going to die out. You're going to lose that element of diversity in your forest. You're going to end up with just a sort of a monoculture of sugar maple. And she hemmed and hawed, didn't want to do it. She talked to her kids. They said, absolutely not. We love our woods. She had enough faith in me that she said, fine, let's do it. This is what it looked like shortly after they did the cut. In January, they cut it in January. The end of August that year, that's what that stand looked like. We had 10 to 12 foot tall stems of aspen shooting up from the roots. That's now young forest cover that for the next 10, 20 years is going to provide habitat for all the species we're talking about. Okay?
Does roadside stripping, does it help at all? I mean, there's always shrubby stuff growing on the side of the road. It's not very deep.
Yeah.
Does that provide any?
Along the roads, usually all you have is that little narrow band of brush that will provide nesting cover for some of the, like catbirds and things you'll find in there, but not sufficient cover for grouse. And I want them to mow that generally because my wife and I just bought a new truck and I want to see that deer before it goes up. Another thing, oak regeneration. If you have oak on your property, you want to regenerate it. Regenerating oak is tough. Providing the conditions at the right time to allow that next crop of acorns to germinate and get up to the sunlight is tough, but that still is going to allow oak to persist and provide a narrow window of grouse cover. Landowner outreach and education, again, talk across your fence. If you're planning a timber sale or thinking about something you'd like to do for wildlife, on your hillside at the top is your line fence, talk to that neighbor. Maybe you could do something together, have a timber sale, and maximize the benefit for wildlife. As I mentioned, working in privately held landscapes is really challenging. Each landowner is going to have their own goals. Around here, increasingly, we've got the weekender, right, the vacation property owner who wants to come out, sit, and to them, as long as it's green, it's beautiful, right? Maybe they're not as interested in a hands-on approach, managing their lands, or maybe they are. We've got traditional family owners, more of a productive mindset perhaps, maybe interested in the dollars. We've got lots of Amish. Anyway, the point is, you break that landscape up into ownership to have a landscape impact. How many folks do you have to talk to? Very, very challenging to have the impact we need. All right, so got to achieve, if we're going to do anything, people say sometimes, maybe the grouse are making a comeback. I saw one the other day. Or maybe there's a chance. We're not going to do anything until we recognize that complexity, all the landowners involved, and achieve greater public acceptance of forests as dynamic systems that require management, and understand that disturbance is not necessarily unnatural. We can mimic wildfires, wind throat, disease to the benefit of forest diversity. And then I'll leave you with a couple quotes. Everybody knows that the autumn landscape in the North Woods is the land plus a red maple plus a ruffed grouse. In terms of conventional physics, the grouse represents only 1/1,000,000th of either the mass or the energy of an acre, yet subtract the grouse and the whole thing is dead. Who said that? Leopold, absolutely. Who remembers the flesh of a grouse in your heart pounding and understands where he's coming from? The woods with rough grouse under your feet is very different from the same woods without it. And then one more quick quote, also from Leopold. I've read many definitions of what is a conservationist, but I expect the best one is written not with a pen, but with an axe. Leopold, 100 years ago now, certainly understood the importance of active management. Okay. Here's my wife and my daughter, who's now a college senior. out checking grouse traps years ago, but anyway, that's what I had, so any questions